Hey, what's up guys, it's Oakley, and today we're going to be going back and covering a bit more of the factions. I decided I would go back and finish these off, or at least continue to cover these, and today we're going to be covering the Saxons. So the Saxons are going to be rather familiar. They're going to be another group of these Germanic tribal confederations from beyond Rome's borders. The Saxons in particular were going to be a confederation of tribes located in northwestern Germany. So again, we're going to be familiar with the pattern of warfare that these tribes would have employed. It would have been heavy raiding, a lot of constant warfare, and most of the armies would have been focused around sort of a nucleus. And that nucleus, as we've described previously with all of the other German confederations, is going to be this core of heavily armed and armored warbands who are serving a powerful individual. This individual's size of his warband would vary with his popularity and strength and power within a certain tribe, and maybe he would even be able to dominate larger regions, but he was supposed to be able to lead this warband into battle, gain them honor and booty, and there was a dynamic relationship. They would serve him as long as he would be able to provide them, gold and glory, essentially, and so there was a give and take, and once these guys got rolling, they would get larger warbands, stronger warbands, more powerful warlords. They could assimilate much larger groups of these warbands, but at the very end of it, there was like a threshold of how large these warbands could be. If they were going to ever assemble into large armies, this would only ever be, as I said, the nucleus of the force. The more holistic view of the army, the more sort of bread and butter of this army is going to be the more ill-equipped and more numerous light infantrymen and skirmishers supplying the bulk of the army, and there would have been some cavalry contingents. However, the predominance of the heavy cavalry is not going to be super well noted. It's not going to be huge. They mostly would have been used for raiding and to chase down opposing forces. Much of these Germanic tribes would have been mostly focused on infantry. However, the one thing that does kind of set the Saxons apart from their eastern neighbors is that the Saxons are obviously going to have access to the sea. And if you take a raiding culture and you give them access to the sea, well, that's just going to, multiply their reach and how far they can perhaps go with their raiding. So you're going to see them traveling much greater distances, especially when their targets are going to appear vulnerable. This is going to be the case in the 5th century, when you're going to see a lot of these Saxon strikes going all along the coast of Gaul and Britain. So let's go ahead and take a look at Rome, because obviously that's going to be a large target for the Saxons, for many of these Germanic tribes. And Rome was always fighting a battle with the Germanic tribes, trying to keep them at bay, and a lot of that had to do with intimidation. Once Rome appeared weak, you would see a successive, series of invasions and incursions. The barbarians would take advantage of Rome's basically lapse anytime there would be a big major military defeat, or Romans were drawn, further into the empire, away from the borders. The barbarians would attack, then Rome would have to go ahead and regain, reinstill fear on the borders by launching, punitive assaults, and that's kind of the story of how the frontier with Germany goes. But when it comes to Britain, especially, let's zoom in on that. So Romans initially invaded Britain around 50 BC. Caesar came in first, and then later you had successive invasions. Caesar's was only really a probing mission, but most of the island was subdued by around 120 AD. And however, the northern borders with like the Scots and the Picts was never conquered, and that's why you see the construction of Hadrian's Wall. And as I said, the Romans were always looking to their frontiers and trying to stem the assault of the barbarians. And so one way to do that is to construct a physical wall, and that's going to be Hadrian's Wall, as I said, which was constructed in around 125 AD. And that's going to protect the northern frontier, and it's pretty crazy. That wall was garrisoned for, I believe, about 300 years. And that's crazy. And it wasn't always the fallback point for the Romans. They had many forts and outposts further there, but it was at least a fallback position they could go to, and it was a hard way to check that wall. But that's a physical wall on land. Look on the east, that whole seaboard is going to be exposed. And so as you see a wane of Roman power, it's going to incur more barbarian invasions, and especially with that undefended eastern seaboard, and you have these groups like the Saxons, the Danes, the Jutes, and the Geats, they're going to be raiding across that shoreline, and so Rome has to react, and so that's what they're going to do. And so they're going to be constructing a series of defenses along the English Channel known as the Saxon Shore forts, and those are going to be just various defenses, usually centered around cities. You would have beefed them up, and so the countryside would have been more susceptible to raiding, but Rome really had to cut its losses and focus around several major cities, and so you see the militarization of that coast in reaction to the additional pressures put on by the raiding powers. And one of the things that's very hard to do is to beat back these types of raids. It's one thing to try and beat back raids on land. I mean, they're moving relatively slower, but at sea, once Roman power starts to wane and you don't really have a border patrol or like a fleet or any small navy, going back and forth along the channel, then you have these ships that can strike with near seeming, invulnerability. They can strike when and wherever they please. They travel much faster than forces on land, and so trying to react to those guys, by the time you hear a city's under assault and you send your force there, the raiders would have come in, raided, and come out, and so that's why you see static defenses being deployed. However, even those defenses aren't really going to be enough as Roman power in the west starts to wane and fade, and troops are going to be drawn away from this area to try and, shore up Roman power at the core of its empire. And this is where you're going to see more of the Saxons have a little bit more significant advances into Roman lands. So either through conquest or settlement, a rather significant figure of Saxons are going to actually find themselves overrunning southeastern Britain, and they're going to assimilate with the Romano-Celts. This group is going to form what's known as the Anglo Saxons, and they're going to eventually organize into the Kingdom of England. However, not all the Saxons obviously would have migrated towards the island. Many Saxons stayed on the continent. Those guys would have also witnessed a great extent of migration and fighting. Particularly one of the main conflicts they would have been involved with was fighting with the Franks. And this would have been a bloody series of wars, very brutal, and it would eventually result in the subjugation of the Saxons by the Franks. The Saxons, that is, became a tributary state under the Carolingian Empire, which was sort of early on founded by Charles Martel, but was officially founded and recognized as the Carolingian Empire upon the crowning of Charlemagne. So I hope that does put it into perspective. They are definitely going to be a fun faction, and I am really interested to see how they play out in terms of these naval invasions and just how they can strike out. That's something you're not going to see quite with the other factions on land, so it does give a twist to the barbarian invasion. This is going to be a barbarian invasion largely led by sea. So I'm very excited to see these guys play out. Hope you guys enjoyed this brief history overlook. See you next time.